Worker uprising is what really scared the Chinese government. They felt that they could deal with the students. After all, students had been involved in uprising for many, many years. But where it became dangerous to the stability and to the survival of the Communist Party was when ordinary workers became involved.
May 20th, before an audience of party faithful, Premier Li Peng imposes martial law on Beijing. Troops would occupy the city and put an end to the protests in Tiananmen Square. Never before in the 40-year history of communist rule had China put its citizens and its army in this situation.
It was a massive display of force, 300,000 troops by most counts, countless tanks, APCs, the lot, all converging on the city from every quarter.
The people just flooded out and physically, with their sheer numbers, simply blocked the road.
The scene that greeted my eyes was just unbelievable. I could see for about a mile in the distance endless serried ranks of transport trucks, completely surrounded by tens of thousands of people. Young women, middle-aged housewives, elderly, retired workers said, "You're not coming in. Sorry, this is our city. There's no chaos. Leave us alone."
So there are 3 or 4 major military convoys in the suburbs of Beijing that can't go forward to Tiananmen Square. They also can't withdraw. They had them fixed there and imposed on them a 24, 48-hour street seminar to explain to them why they shouldn't be doing what they're doing.
The citizens were also quite clever. They brought their children and asked them to say to the soldiers, "How are you, Uncle Soldier?" The soldiers were touched and they said, "We won't kill our people."
4 days after the attempted entry, the army withdrew to bases outside the city. Beijing was euphoric.
So that ended very well and was a great triumph. But it also was an enormous humiliation for the leadership. They had been thwarted, and they had lost face, and they weren't going to let it happen again.
Over the next 10 days, Supreme Leader Deng Xiaoping hatched a new plan. A huge force, spearheaded by tanks, was drawn from military districts across China.
On the night of June 3rd, a huge invasion force coming in again from all directions, but mostly from the west, this time with live ammunition. This time, strict orders, the square must be cleared by dawn on June 4th.
The instructions to the troops said, "We don't want bloodshed, avoid bloodshed." But the other instruction to the troop, which was ironclad, was the square has to be cleared by 6 a.m.
To block the army's advance, the citizens barricaded all the main road bridges and intersections with buses, trucks, heavy earth-moving equipment, anything they could lay their hands on.
Armored personnel carriers came, and they began to ram the buses. Somebody threw some type of gasoline-soaked rug into the buses, and the buses illuminated with fire. Then, sometime after 9:30, you had more soldiers out there, and live fire began.
The first rounds of fire catch everybody by surprise. The people in the streets don't expect this to happen.
They shot, randomly toward all sorts of direction.
Angry citizens were everywhere. People just couldn't understand why this country and its army, the People's Army, would slaughter its own people, the Beijing citizens.
People still pour into the streets. This is the amazing thing. People were just so angry, so furious at what was happening in their city that they were not going to step back and let the army do what it was doing.
A young friend standing next to me shouted, "Overthrow fascism!" Then the soldiers started shooting at us. We immediately threw ourselves to the ground.
Troops began to fire in all different directions. Many people, children, women, ordinary people, were shot standing on their balconies looking down at this spectacle.
They just raked the buildings with their gunfire, and they were shooting people. People were being killed in their own kitchens.
Everybody was frightened by this overwhelming use of force.
Right in front of us, this tall young man, about 20 years old, suddenly fell down. He'd been shot in the chest. Blood was pouring out. We were absolutely shocked. We didn't know how to stop the bleeding. Someone found a bicycle to carry him to the hospital.
I visited 3 hospitals, and we were in total shock because of the large numbers of people wounded being brought to these facilities, most of them being brought on bicycle-pulled carts, and all around us we could hear gunfire.
We went into the hospital through the back entrance where the staff goes. There was a smell. My friend said, "Do you smell that?" And I said, "I smell something sweet." And she said, "That's death. That's what you're smelling."
People started to scream at us, "Pai dian shi, take pictures, take video. Tell the world what's going on. They're killing innocent people."
Basically, it was a one-sided pitched battle all the way from the western suburbs, several miles through the city, until they finally, about 1:30 a.m., began to arrive at Tiananmen Square. This was the crunch time.
You had the military coming in from the west with their tanks. We knew there were tanks coming from the south up Tiananmen Gate, and now on both sides of the square, you had hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers.
And then the firing started. Even at this late stage, many of those in the square couldn't believe the army was using live ammunition and stood their ground.
One man was shot down. Someone ran up and dragged that man. I didn't. I just kept running. On my left side, someone was hit in the neck. Everyone was running.
People were running to the square, and they were running from the square. And people were racing to the square on bikes, racing out of the square on bikes. The ambulances started to go in.
There was a lot of smoke. The lights were on the square, and there was this continual announcement of, under the martial law regulations, no one should be on the street. If you stay on the street, you will be responsible for what happens to you. This sort of continual base beat of that evening was these announcements.
About 4:15 in the morning, suddenly all the lights in the square went out. Pitch dark. This was very frightening.
And then I heard these horrible crushing sounds, like when tanks run over things, crushing splinter sounds.
After about 10 minutes, the lights came on again. And at that point, we could see just a river of troops flowing out of the Great Hall of the People and deploying in front of the monument to the people's heroes.
A large group of students and citizens had made their last stand at the monument. They had witnessed the shooting and killing as the army swept through the square towards them, and many expected the same treatment themselves. But they were wrong. The soldiers held their fire and offered amnesty if they vacated the square at once.
From my point of view, the important thing was to avoid more injury and death. So I made the decision to lead the students out of the square. 3,000 to 5,000 students and citizens left the square by the southeast corner.
I'll never forget those faces, the young people's faces. They were walking out with their heads held high. They'd finessed their retreat from the square so well. They'd performed so bravely. And finally they'd made the right decision. There would have been no point staying there. Everyone would have been killed.
Later that morning, amazing things started to happen. People astonishingly started holding hands, walking up the avenue, trying to re-enter the square in the face of these tanks.
These people were frantic. They were nuts out of their minds. These were parents of students who had been in the square that night. These parents were running back and forth, and they